Hi everyone, my name is Alistair. I'm the product manager here at GetTerms. In this video, I'll walk you through the steps of setting up Google Consent Mode with our CMP. We've got a bit to get through, but before we start, I think it's important that you understand the basics of what Consent Mode is doing so that you can apply it to your own setups more generally. Consent Mode lets consent platforms like GetTerms share a visitor's consent preferences with Google tags and products through something called consent signals. For example, we can tell your Google tag when it can start storing user data for analytics, or your Google Ads remarketing tag when it can store data for ad personalization. Based on this, it would be fair for you to wonder why you need consent mode when your consent banner is already blocking cookies until consent is given. The answer to this is fairly simple. Consent mode, unlike the standard setup, allows you to retain some depersonalized information when users deny cookies and take advantage of something called consent mode modeling. So simply put, at the moment, privacy laws are limiting tracking when users don't consent, which leaves gaps in your data. Consent mode modeling fills these gaps with aggregated data from similar consenting users. This way, your reporting is more complete and compliant. If you want to know more about consent mode and how it works, I'll link you to our complete guide to consent mode in the description. Okay, let's get on with the setup process. I'm using a demo site that already has our banner installed. If you haven't installed our banner yet, don't worry. I will show you how to install it in a second. However, I won't cover any of the settings outside of those related to consent mode. For that, you'll need to watch our cookie banner setup video. I'll also leave a link to that in the description. So firstly, let's make sure that you've installed our banner in the correct position. For consent mode to work, you'll need to place your GetTerms script above your Google Tag Manager opening script. This is important as we'll need to set some instructions for Google prior to Tag Manager running. As you can see, our script is pasted here in our header, right above our Google Tag Manager opening script. You can find your GetTerms script in the installation tab of your dashboard. So if you navigate to here, you'll see the installation tab and you'll find your embed code here. Next, we'll need to enable consent mode in the GetTerms dashboard. You can do this in one of two ways. Firstly, you can head to the dedicated Google Consent Mode page and enable it here, or you can head to the configuration tab and enable it here. Either way, the setting will apply and the behavior will be the same. Once you've toggled on Google Consent Mode, you'll see a new setting pop up within each of your region-specific configurations called the default consent state. Now, this should align with the consent preset for that region. For example, if it's opt-in, consent by default is denied. If it's opt-out, consent by default is granted. If you are using a custom consent setting, just make sure that the default consent state aligns with the consent requirements in that jurisdiction. So for opt-in jurisdictions, it should be set to denied. For opt-out jurisdictions, it should be set to granted. From here, you can navigate down to the save button and hit save. And consent mode is now enabled in our dashboard. Now we'll need to integrate it with Google Tag Manager. Our demo Google Tag Manager container contains a Google tag and a Hotjar tag. The reason I've chosen these tags is one is a Google tag and one is a third-party tag, meaning while we can use consent mode for both of them to configure them for consent, we'll need to use two different implementations. Now, before we do anything, we'll need to add the GetTerms CMP tag template to your container. So to do this, make sure you're on the Tags tab and head to the New Tag button and click. From here, you can click anywhere in the tag configuration window and select the Discover More tag types in the Community Tag Template Gallery. Click this and wait for it to load. Next, we'll use the search function to find the GetTerms CMP tag template and click Add to Workspace and add. This template contains all of the code required to connect your consent banner with Google Tag Manager and consent mode. Next, we're going to configure the triggering behavior. Click anywhere within the triggering window and select consent initialization. This trigger happens before page initialization, which ensures our banner updates the consent settings of your users before your other tags load. It's only for your CMP, so don't attach any other tags to the consent initialization or pages trigger. Now, click save, and I recommend sticking with the suggested tag name. Click save again. Now you should see the GetTerms CMP tag alongside both of your other tags. Next, we're going to enable a tool called the Consent Overview tool. The Consent Overview shows which tags are configured for consent and allows you to adjust them in bulk if needed. So to enable it, you head to the Administration tab and click Container Settings and tick the box to enable Consent Overview. Hit Save, and now when you navigate back to your workspace and open the Tags tab, you should see a little icon displaying a shield with a tick on it. This is your consent overview. From here, as mentioned before, you can see which tags are configured and which are not. And as we can see, I haven't configured any of my tags for consent. To configure your tags for consent, all you have to do is select the tag that you would like to configure and select the Edit Consent Settings button at the top here. Now you'll be given 3 different options. Not set, which essentially means the tag is not configured for consent and will fire whether consent is given or whether consent isn't given. We have an entire article explaining consent mode and the different implementations that come with it, but for the purpose of this guide, you need to understand that when you use consent mode, you can either choose advanced consent mode or basic consent mode. With advanced consent mode, you're allowing a tag to run without waiting for consent, or in other words, no additional consent required. This is only possible because these tags perform extra consent checks called built-in consent checks, which will prevent them from setting cookies or collecting any personal data unless the user has consented. So essentially the tag fires, and then the tag performs its consent checks, and if consent is not granted, it's not going to do anything. The other configuration, basic consent mode, only allows a tag to fire after the relevant consent type has been granted, or in other words, require additional consent for a tag to fire. Essentially, this is adding consent checks for tags that do not have them built in already. It's really useful because it allows us to bootstrap onto the consent mode infrastructure for third-party tags, like our Hotjar tag. For our Google tag, we know that Google understands consent mode and listens to consent signals and performs its own built-in consent checks. So we can select no additional consent required. However, as we can see, when we look in the built-in consent column, our Hotjar tag contains no built-in consent checks. So we're going to need to tell it what type of consent to wait for before it fires. Select the tick box and then open the Edit Consent Settings window and select Require Additional Consent for the tag to fire. In other words, basic consent mode. Now, we're going to need to add the required consent type that Google Tag Manager should wait for before allowing this tag to fire. So if we click this, given this is Hotjar, we know that it's an analytics cookie. You'll be able to find all of the different types of cookies on your site and how they're categorized by looking in our cookie management tab. And you should find that, so for example, our scanner has found on our site a selection of advertising cookies and a selection of performance or analytics cookies. As we can see, our Hotjar tags analytics cookies. So from this dropdown, we're going to select analytics storage. If your cookie or tag corresponds with a different cookie type, so for example, a functional cookie or a advertising cookie, you would select the corresponding storage type from this dropdown. Security storage is a storage type that's only to be used for essential cookies. Now, this isn't essential for your purposes. This is essential for your users to use your site. In other words, if a cookie is required for your site to load or for your users to securely log into your site, then you can use essential storage or security storage. In all other purposes, you'll need to use one of these 4 storage types. And we'll select the Save button here. Finally, GetTerms CMP tag. Now, we don't actually need to do anything with this one, but just for the sake of it, we can see built-in consent is being performed by our tag. So we can select this and select no additional consent required and hit save. Now, all of our tags have been configured for consent and our consent mode setup is essentially complete. However, I do recommend that you review that everything is working correctly, and I'm going to show you how to do this. Firstly, hit the preview button and input your URL in the text field here and hit connect. Now we should see our banner pop up and cookies not being set at this current point. If you don't see your banner pop up, it could be that you've already provided consent for your cookie banner, or you might have your cookie banner configured to be hidden in your region that you're testing from. So head over to the GetTerms dashboard and go to the configuration tab and make sure that your banner's consent setting is not sent to no banner in the region that you're testing from. For testing purposes, I recommend just sticking with the opt-in setting and hit save. And you should see that your banner reappears. Give it about 2 minutes as there could be some caching going on. If this is not the case and you've accepted cookies, you should be able to delete your cookie preferences by clicking the inspect function and then go to the application tab and navigate to local storage and select your website and delete the GetTerms cookie consent local storage item. Now, when we refresh the page, you should see that your banner reappears. Next, we're going to make sure that all of these consent signals are coming through in the right order and that they're being listened to by Google Tag Manager. So if we navigate to the Tag Assistant page, we should see that the most recent page load, there is a consent default where our banner sets the default consent state. Given I've set mine to opt-in, in my location, the cookie storage is all going to be set to denied. If you've set it to opt out, it will say granted. And of course, because essential cookies are always granted, the security storage will always say granted. Next, our banner loads and the current consent state is set to denied. This is because we haven't provided any consent preferences. So there is no on-page update, and the consent settings are going to be set to whatever the default for your region is. And of course, when the initialization happens, where all of your tags fire, it's going to use the current consent state, which is denied. Now, what this should mean is when you go to the tags tab, you'll see that your Google tag has fired, but your Hotjar tag has been blocked by the consent settings. Don't worry about the GetTerms CMP not firing, because this of course happens on consent initialization. Now, remembering that our Google tag is set up for advanced consent mode, the fact that it's firing does not mean it's collecting personal information. As we can see, if we navigate to our consent tab, everything is set to denied. And if we were to navigate back to our website, we should see that when we head to our application tab, that we are not setting any cookies. And you can reload the page and you should see that no cookies are being set, despite the fact that our Google tag is being initiated. Now, when we go back to our site, we can select accept all. The page should reload, allowing scripts to run. And when we navigate back to the Tag Assistant tab, we should see that the default consent state is still set to whatever the default consent state is in your region, but now there is a consent update, which updates all of the storage types to granted. On consent initialization, it sets the current consent state, which is all granted, and then on initialization, you should see the exact same settings being sent through. So when we navigate to the tags tab, both our Google tag and Hotjar tag are firing. Assuming that your setup looks identical to mine, from here, it's safe to say that your consent mode setup is configured correctly. But of course, you never know. There could be small differences per page, and we'd obviously like to make sure that everything is set up on all of our pages. So to help you with this, we've built a debugger tool that will notify you if any pages load and consent is configured incorrectly. So if you navigate to the GetTerms dashboard, you can then click the GetTerms consent mode page and scroll down to the validation tools we have here. Now we have two of these. You can enable installation diagnostics. This will send you an email once a day with any errors that are being flagged by our system. In addition to this, we also built a console debugging tool. So if we select this and head back to our website, now when we hit F12 to open up the developer tools and select console, when you refresh the page, you'll see information load about your consent mode setup. This allows you to see the behavior of our CMP in real time. You'll see the different steps that our CMP performs, and you'll see any errors that are flagged by our debugger. So if your script was installed in the wrong location, or if tags are firing before consent is set up, then all of these will be shown here. You can also see the different consent preferences for each cookie type. So if I was to update my consent preferences and remove functional cookies and hit save, we should see that the functional cookies now say false, but all others are set to true. Now, just for testing purposes, I'm going to move my CMP script below the opening tag of my Google Tag Manager installation tag and hit update. Now, when I load a page, we should see that our CMP flags this error. There we go. So now you can see Google Tag Manager loaded before consent mode default command. We'll also be given a recommendation to move the consent mode script above the GTM tag in the head section. And if I was to navigate to the debug page, we should also see the installation errors, and we can see which page this occurred on and how to resolve it. You can then hit mark resolved if you've changed this. So if I now navigate here, I'm going to move this back to the correct location and select update. And now if I navigate back here, I can say mark as resolved. Now we can see there is resolved errors and the GTM before consent error is being shown there. If we find this on another page, like if the error reoccurs, it's going to be moved back to installation errors. If we then mark it as unresolved, I just wanted to show you that you can also ignore an error. If you know something is going on and it's a function that you can't change, but it makes no impact on the consent setup of your website, you can select ignore. Now you won't be notified in any emails if this error keeps occurring. One thing I do recommend is that you disable console debugging when you're not using it, because this will be visible to your users in the unlikely circumstances that they visit the console section when using your website. So now the consent mode's all set up, we can navigate back to Google Tag Manager and publish our container. And that's it. Consent mode is set up. If you have any questions about this guide, or if you just need a bit more information, feel free to contact us on our support channels. I hope this guide was super helpful. And as always, thanks for trusting GetTerms with your compliance. Bye for now.